Good morning and welcome to the OER Creation Faculty Panel. We are going to be talking about creating your own OER, these faculty experiences and insights. My name is Caterina Azzarello and I'll be moderating this session. Our panelists today are Dr. Rose Grose, Associate Professor for the Colorado School of Public Health at UNC, Dr. Corinne Wieben, Professor of the Department of History, and Dr. Michael Kimball, Professor in the Department of Anthropology. Please know that today's session will be recorded and the recording and transcript will be available after the video has processed. We are committed to accessibility, so sometimes the processing might take a little bit of extra time. Today's session will take over this format. We're going to start with a brief definition of OER, just so that we're all on the same page about its meaning. Then we'll proceed through the questions for our panelists. They've received them ahead of time, so they should be a little prepared for their answers. And basically, I'll read a question and then we'll go in alphabetical and reverse alphabetical order for responding. At the end, we will save a few minutes so the members of the audience can ask questions. So with that, let's get started. We'll start with defining OER. Open educational resources are no-cost learning materials that are either in the public domain or that carry an open license, which legally allow for the 5R activities. Those 5R activities are retain, revise, reuse, remix, and redistribute. All of our panelists today have created their own OER, which are all freely available and adaptable. More and more UNC instructors are choosing OER for their courses, and today's panel includes 3 faculty, like I said, that have both created and adapted OER. All right, let's get started with some questions. Oh, sorry. I meant to hit stop sharing. So we'll start with just a brief introduction. So can you please briefly introduce yourself and describe your OER project and explain what motivated you to create your OER? And we'll go first name. So if Corinne, if you'd like to start.
Sure. So for my first OER project, I created a combination textbook sourcebook for my course on the history of magic. And it was really just because I couldn't find even a paid publication that had exactly what I wanted. When I'm teaching history, I do a lot of focusing on marginalized groups, and I just couldn't find anything that didn't focus on elite men. And so I decided to create this source book, this reader, which I can, I think, pop up here. Yeah. So I created this, as you can see, this source book, and really just created it in Google Docs. Extremely easy, especially if you use headers and you kind of learn the formatting to make your documents accessible. Created an automatic table of contents, which students have actually commented on, saying that they like that they didn't have to go searching for the documents. And then was able to just contextualize the sources that I wanted to use and find, dug up some public domain sources and was able to revise the language a little bit to update it. And included things like discussion questions and focus questions for the students. So it's incredibly simple, and yet is probably saving the students in this class $50 to $100 a semester, especially because when I found source books, I didn't like using all of their contents, and so I would often supplement anyway. So this is able to save the students a lot of money and make these texts a little bit more accessible to them.
Awesome, thank you. Next, we'll go to Michael.
Great. Yeah, I've done a couple of OERs. One is before I knew a whole lot, and the other part was after a really wonderful presentation by Nancy that actually brought me up to speed on what's possible. And so the one that I did that I'm going to showcase a little bit right now was the one before. And there was a small grant that the Office for Instructional Design was offering. And I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to experiment with some ideas. So what I proposed was I'm in addition to professor of anthropology, I'm also a mindfulness teacher. So and I'd been integrating mindfulness of one kind or another into my curricula. And so I was interested in seeing what it would be like to create a module that others could do that too, a Canvas-based module that others could do too. So I'll share my screen really quick here and just show you a couple of pages of it. What I decided to do was I wanted to challenge myself and I guess also the instructional design office, which has some real talented folks that really pitched in to make this work. To not just focus on written content, but try something different and look at sort of a video podcast kind of approach. So what we have here is, can everybody see the screen? I think so. There's a bright green square around it also. I'm hopeful that means it's working. So you can see these elements here: introduction, preparing, managing, learning, practicing. So preparing, managing, learning, practicing are for, I originally thought of them as modules, but because of the architecture of Canvas, they're something else. But they're basically four little mini modules that focus on a different application of mindfulness. Preparing is how to prepare for class, to work with your state of mind in the moment. Managing is how to manage stress coming from a looming exam or some other kind of deadline. The third is learning from discomfort, which I thought was an interesting one, especially since we're, as a society, we tend to be pretty discomfort aversive. So mindfulness helps us kind of work with that and learn and actually use it as a learning tool. And then practicing is a way to practice with mindful reading, because a lot of our students are distracted, to put it mildly, by lots of technology, and so bringing attention back to actual reading is a real skill that can be applied both in an academic way and also just in personal life. So I built this in collaboration, as I said, with the Instructional Design Office, but also with Dr. Dannon Cox, who's a public health professor, but also very skilled and lots of experience in working with media like podcasting. And so what we did was we set up a little podcast for each of these components. So I'm not going to play the podcast for you, but I'll just show you the structure here that we had, where we shot with instructional design videos of an interview, a conversation between Dannon and myself around these topics, and it made it accessible, it made it interesting, it was conversational, so it was a different approach than the didactic approach, and I like how it turned out. So what we did was we put it up on Canvas, or instructional design put it up on Canvas, and so far it's been downloaded a number of times, and I'm happy to talk about that some more later, but I'll stop right there.
Thank you. That sounds awesome. I kind of want to download it now. And I'll hand it over to Rose.
Can you hear me all? Yeah, okay. My kind of the project I want to talk about today is when I had to really update a whole undergraduate class. It was the first time I was teaching the class. I teach in the Colorado School of Public Health, so I do a lot of Masters of Public Health programming. So I've been in public health for a while, but I got a new course that really needed an overhaul and an update. And so as I was doing this, and it was already open access, OER based, so had no textbook for me to sort of find the new edition and work from. And what I ended up creating was essentially a 15-week course outline with weekly objectives, different readings, all available online for free, videos, discussion prompts, and some different activity ideas. So it's explicitly designed to be able to kind of pull out pieces. If you were faculty and, were starting this class on your own, you would be able to, take 1 week and work with or swap out any of the weeks. So I can share my screen as well, just so you see. I was just going to show one kind of module. Can everybody see something that says infectious diseases? Okay, great. So this is just a quick overview. It kind of explains what the module is all about, how many weeks long it is, which sessions are covered. So this is a class called Modern Concepts of Health and Disease. It's very much a kind of survey class of, I would call it like Public Health 101 for undergraduate students. So we cover a little bit of a lot of things. And so it breaks it down by week with different learning objectives. And then this is where most of the work went into finding accessible resources online. And luckily, I have a background in public health. I wasn't just starting from no knowledge. I've been doing this at the graduate level. So thinking about how to take some of those materials and make it accessible to undergrads. And in the last 5-6 years, there's been some really amazing YouTube a series of videos about public health, since 2020 and the pandemic, like high quality, high budget videos on topics that are central to this course. Like, why would I create a lecture that's going to be me and some slides when I could use American Public Health Association or other videos that have been really done well? So assigned videos, really trying to find a balance between short readings from the well-established sources, World Health Organization, CDC, and then also videos. Oh my gosh, I didn't silence my phone. Horrible. And then an outline of kind of what's covered in the lecture in class, and then if there was a graded assignment. So that's really the main OER resource that's now available for faculty to be able to, pick and choose from. And then one thing that I've used before in my classes, I use it for all of my classes really, is something called Padlet. Now, Padlet itself is not open access. It does cost money to have a Padlet subscription. It's $99 a year. But it's a great way to get optional and recommended materials, or just a way for students to dig in more, because this class covers so many different things. And I have a human sexuality class that's the same way, as we cover so many different things, and you never know what a student's going to be passionate about or want to know more about. So this is the one from that same module. And it's essentially a resource where I can just keep adding to it over time with videos that might be in the assigned readings, or just extra things that students can check out. So you can add any sort of number of topics. This is all about infectious diseases, and include anything that I might want them to just have access to in the future. So those are the main things that I've been working on.
Awesome. And I also use Padlet in my class, but the free version. Thank you. So now I'd love to know, and we're going to start with Grose this time. What was the most challenging part of creating your OER, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, great question. So for me, it was just like the sheer volume of information on the internet. There's a ton of great resources. And so just weeding through all of that, I tend to be a person who over prepares. So I had more than enough resources to go from. So then trying to decide from that what was going to be appropriate for a class I had never taught before. When I was prepping, literally as I was teaching it, because I just found out right before the semester started, I was going to be teaching it. So yeah, trying to be reasonable about like how many readings, how many videos can students actually work with, each week. So that was probably the biggest. And so really focusing on trying to have a variety of learning modalities, videos versus readings versus interactive activities. And then ongoing, it's the fact that these websites change all the time. So I have to check every single web link every single time that I'm doing anything. And I think that, I'm sure the other faculty agree, like that's just part of the process when you're using free resources online. But it was a time when public health is being scrutinized from multiple angles, and government websites are being modified and censored and changed. And so I would say more than usual, the links are not stable in a way that they might have been even 2 years ago. So that's been a challenge for me.
Thank you. And Michael?
Yeah, I don't know if challenging is the word for it, but there was a lot of collaboration needed to make this happen. I could not have done it alone. So, you can have some great ideas, but unless you're able to team up with the right people, they're just going to stay ideas. And so, because I had this partnership through the mini grant with instructional design, the tech part of it was handled with, again, these very skilled people. Shooting the video, editing the videos, all the stuff that I don't have time nor the expertise to be able to accomplish, nor the technology. Without Dan and Cox's help, it wouldn't. He's a skilled interviewer, and again, very familiar with podcasting, and so without him, it would have been a real climb. So I think that while that's challenging from the standpoint of when you have a great idea, how do you make it happen? It's also really fulfilling when you are able to pull the team together and see what happens through a creative approach. What I'd like to think is a creative approach to creating an OER. So yeah, that's my response.
Absolutely. So we have like sheer amount of information, we have collaboration, and I'd love to know, Corinne, what was the most challenging part for you?
Because I work mostly in pre-modern history, what ended up being most challenging for me was just finding texts that were in the public domain, but were also easily translatable or transcribable to a digital format. I ended up doing a lot of just manual transcribing. And because so many of the texts that are in the public domain were translations from like the 19th century, I ended up having to revise some of the language. And I ended up having to do a lot of extra research to kind of navigate public domain versus fair use, and how much can I revise a text depending on which one of those licenses I'm using. And so that I think for me ended up being the biggest challenge, was just navigating some of the copyright rules around the text.
Thank you. We'll mix it up a little bit. So next question is, how did creating your own materials change or not change your teaching practices? And let's go ahead and start with Michael.
Okay. Yeah, the main difference is that, as an educator, I tend to create content for a specific audience. So it might be, a class or a workshop or something like that, or a conference presentation. And so you kind of know your audience. In this case, I'm making something for anyone who's interested. And that's kind of that inserts a kind of randomness into the picture that is hard to it's hard to strategize specifically for. And so it challenged me to think differently about how to make something accessible and make it open enough so that it's applicable to a lot of different needs.
Thank you. Rose?
Yeah, I would say it kind of extended what I had already been doing in the teaching practices. It didn't really, I don't think, fundamentally change them. I'm always trying to be trauma informed and equity focused, and really create learning opportunities for students that they can apply to the real world. Public health is practice based. I'm from psychology and gender studies as well, and it's all real world impact types of topics. And so this is just another way to extend that, making sure that I'm finding materials that reflect current events, outbreaks that are happening right now, avian flu, or trauma-informed resources that are from, well-established sources, ways that we can combat misinformation in public health, and providing tools that I'm hoping that students will be able to access and use long after the class is over. Sometimes with a digital textbook, there's only access for a short period of time, or the students might rent a textbook from the bookstore and they don't necessarily have access to that into the future. But with public health, I want you to be able to share that video with your friend or your family member, or use it again when you go to graduate school. So it was just another way to integrate that even more into what I'm doing. So I would say it didn't necessarily change it too much. Even with creating an outline that other faculty can use, I think having it be that structured was maybe the biggest change. I'm always happy to share my course materials with junior faculty or graduate students. And I like to mentor in teaching. It's my favorite part of the job. So, but yeah, being able to just put that out there, I put a ton of work into this. You don't have to start from scratch or reinvent the wheel. Like, use what you can, I think really reinforced what I've been doing since I've been at UNC.
Excellent. And Corinne?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is kind of realizing how simple this was for me. I've started to do the same exercise in all of my courses. But one of the things I've really found that has changed is I'm able to be much more responsive to the students' curiosity. So if the students get really interested in a particular type of text, or they want to hear more about something, that's something that I can go in and kind of remix and change. And we all have access to the same thing now, which is really great. And so I'm much more able, I think, to react in real time to what the students want to learn more about and are actually curious about. The other thing, too, is a large number of our history majors are history secondary ed. And I didn't realize until some of them told me that I'm creating things that they can borrow and remix and repurpose when they start teaching. So that's, I think, been really valuable for me to know, is that it's not just for me, it's not just for other instructors in other university settings, but the students that we're training to be teachers are learning how to create and remix and repurpose OER in their own courses. So that's been really rewarding.
Yes, that's amazing. Like, influencing the next generation of teachers. Excellent. So our next question is, what impact have you seen on students or heard from students since implementing your OER? And we'll just go right back to Corinne.
Sure. Definitely one of the things I've noticed is that students consistently comment in course evaluations on how much they appreciate the OER. Just being able to access the text in a way that is equitable and easy for everyone. That's been one of the big changes I've noticed. Definitely, I've noticed more student engagement and participation. And I truly think that is just the fact that we can all access all of the materials together at the same time, kind of work with them hands-on in class. I think even if we take published texts and put them on reserve at the library with the best of intentions, it's still asking the students to perform an extra step to access those materials, even though it is still free to them. So there's still a barrier. And I think one of the things that OER does is it removes barriers of time and effort as well as money for the students and makes it much more equitable.
Amazing. I totally agree. Michael?
So mine is a little bit different because it was shared in the Canvas Commons kind of structure. It wasn't something that, I got to track with my own students. So what I do notice, though, because the stats are available, you can see how many times it was downloaded. So that's kind of interesting. And it was packaged in two different ways: as a Canvas course, which means it's sort of standalone. You would just import it. And the other is as a Canvas module, which you can import into your existing Canvas shell. So there were since I created it or since it went live, there's been 9 course downloads and 13 module downloads, which seem like small numbers, but when you think about, if a faculty member is incorporating it in one way or another into a curriculum, then you've got however many students are in that class checking it out. I also had a colleague that I spoke with recently who's doing some research around mindfulness in higher education, and told her about this OER, and she's on sabbatical, so she ended up just for free creating a Canvas account for herself. And because it's in the Commons, she could download the package, and so it's available in that way too to pretty much anyone, which is very exciting. So again, don't know the impact on students really, but do know that it is doing some kind of reach out there.
That's amazing. Rose?
Yeah, so I like to do final reflection papers for my classes to see what is going on with course materials. What do they find the most helpful? What kinds of improvements would they make? Because I don't always get the details that I want in an evaluation. And so I asked explicitly about OER in a couple of different ways. And obviously there's some response bias. They're probably telling me a little bit what I want to hear. And I do think authentically, it really helped reduce their financial stress and their ability to participate. They were able to start right away. I know in my other class that has a paid textbook, there's often a delay at the beginning of the semester. They don't necessarily start right away. They can't access it for different financial reasons. I've had people who haven't been able to access it for weeks and weeks. And so they definitely notice that, oh, I can jump right in and participate right away. A few other comments made it feel like this was really helping them personalize their learning. Like, yes, we had required readings. And because I had a Padlet with the optional and recommended things, they really felt that they were able to learn the way that was most useful for them and like what worked for their learning style. And it seemed that they really appreciated how like current this was. There was some comments about like other textbooks not necessarily being up to date or being current, and that this was a way that helped them get that real world public health issue information, and also knowing that this was connected to current events. Especially last spring when there was a lot of executive orders happening and just a lot of things in public health occurring. And then my favorite quote out of this was about somebody actually connected it to one of the main concepts of the class. And I was like, they got the whole point. Because we talk a lot about social determinants of health. And so this is how things like poverty is connected to our health outcomes and, our education system, and really all of these structures around us actually end up having an impact on our health more than our own health behaviors, right? Because these environments constrain what we have access to and our opportunities. And so one of them made the comment that, taking away that financial obligation and making sure we all have equal access to these resources they said, as we learned, our social determinants determine our outcomes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even I hadn't really pieced that together even myself before they said that. And I was like, yes, this is exactly the kind of teaching I want to do that really, shares those values of the, the public health core. So that was cool.
I always love getting a good feedback from a student. It's like, I promise I didn't pay for that feedback, but that's amazing. So looking back, what do you wish you had known before starting your OER project? And I'll just go right back to Rose, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was not actually my first attempt at OER. I tried it before. And for my human sexuality class, because the textbook I was using was quite outdated and it was taking them forever to make a new version of this. So in the meantime, I was like, all right, I got to be supplementing some things here because this is, just way too outdated. So the first project was to try to find an existing open access textbook. And so the thing that I wish I had known was that sometimes those things just do not exist. I think, like Corinne was saying, like it's just not available. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to find something that I could use, and ultimately ended up just deciding there's just I can't not use a real textbook, a real textbook for this class. There were too many trade-offs with quality, with how comprehensive it was. Yes, it was outdated, but it was evidence-based and like really backed up with a lot of research in a way that the books online weren't. So the trying to balance like the flexibility, the inclusion, like Corinne was also talking about, right? Like these textbooks don't necessarily reflect the diversity that I always want to see in my class, and are not as current as I wish that they were. The book I was using, for instance, didn't have anything about PrEP in it. And that is a technology that's absolutely essential for preventing HIV. It's pre-exposure prophylaxis, and it was not in this book. So I was already having to supplement things. So I wish I had known just a little bit more about that, but I had to learn by reading what was available and how it was not going to meet my very high standards for what this book was supposed to be. And that creating like any one of these resources is kind of equivalent in time and energy to like writing a textbook for free. And I'm not interested in writing a textbook for free. Even with the helpful grants from the library, that is not something that I have the bandwidth for. And so just kind of knowing when to sort of let it go, I think maybe as part of the lesson, it was like, all right, this is not going to happen. Let's rethink this. And also just, it's really okay to start big and keep refining. And I think the other thing I was surprised about was just how many students don't actually read the books that they get in. I mean, I just, that was not the kind of student that I was. So I was shocked, kind of a little shocked by some of the responses I did get in the feedback from students. I use a digital book in my other class. They have to have it to be able to submit quizzes. So I would absolutely know if somebody didn't buy the book. They're like, I can check. But in a class that's just a hard copy book, like you might not ever know whether your student really got that resource or not. So that was a little bit of a surprise that maybe I wish I had thought about this sooner and started working on some of this even earlier in my career at UNC.
Thank you. We'll head over to Michael.
So when I went into this, I was very green, with respect to even really understanding what OER was. I just thought, what a cool way to, create a resource that gets out there beyond my own classroom or my own scope. So that was a great project. I really enjoyed doing it. I love the collaboration. But as I mentioned, I sort of touched on this in my introduction. I learned a lot more when I attended Nancy's presentation, which really made it clear that there's just this huge array of options for how to, and Rose kind of just touched on this too. There's a huge array of options for what you can create. And it can be down to a single assignment, or it could be something much larger like a textbook, or it could be, in my case, a series of mini modules focused on a particular topic, done in a completely different way. So if I had known, then what I know now, I'd still probably do what I did because I was excited to do it. But I also would have started to think a little bit more broadly about what the possibilities are.
Thank you. And Corinne?
Yeah, I think one of the big things I would have done is made the project more student driven from the start and incorporated more student feedback. So thanks to a second OER grant, right now I'm working on a combination textbook and source book for my early Western civilization survey. And one of the things I've started to do is kind of informally survey my students to see what formats, what content, what ideas might help them more in that course. So, and especially with seeing just the sheer variety of things that we're capable of doing, whether it's incorporating Padlet to include more multimedia presentations, whether it's creating a podcast or creating videos. Kind of surveying the students will, I hope, help me create materials that are more useful and more valuable to them.
That's all amazing. So kind of in the same vein, for faculty who are OER curious, but maybe a little bit overwhelmed, what would you recommend as a manageable starting point? And we'll start with Corinne.
Yeah, so the source book that I created for the History of Magic course also wasn't my first attempt at OER. I did a seminar over the summer a while ago with the National Humanities Center, and the summative assignment for that was that we had to create an OER lesson plan for just a single topic. And so that was what I started with. And that it was involved and it was a lot, and I had a lot of like multimedia stuff involved with it. But because it was just a single lesson, it was contained, it was kind of easy for me to think about and describe and encompass. And so I would recommend starting small. Start with a single lesson plan, start with a single module, experiment with what you can do, and know that anything you create, you can change. You can change on the fly, you can moderate it, you can expand it into an entire course if you want. But I would start with something small and manageable first and experiment with what's possible with just that one thing.
Excellent. Michael?
I would just echo Corinne's advice there. I think it makes a lot of sense not to overwhelm yourself with a big project, and just start small and see how it turns out, and then build from there. I also would add that, there may be something you have been kind of playing with, and we've heard that from our other panelists here, playing with that's either bothered you about how it's being taught, or it's something new you want to try, an innovation, whatever it might be. This is your chance. This is your chance to kind of create the space for doing something like that. And so it's a great opportunity to do that. But again, starting small is really key. Says the guy who didn't start small. So.
Excellent. And then Rose?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everyone else. The other thing I would say is, starting with a course topic that you know a lot about already. Like, so this is, something that you've been teaching and maybe you have tweaked things or been playing around with things. But so even though I had never taught modern concepts of health and disease, I've been teaching in a Master's of Public Health program for 7 years, whatever, I don't know. And so I know what topics are essential. I know what resources are considered to be evidence-based, sort of best practices, who are the more respected and reputable organizations and associations. So I didn't have to do as much background research to know, like, oh, is this going to be a source that is actually useful or considered the best in field. I sort of already had that background knowledge. And so that's, I think, a big recommendation I would make. And then I know we've already commented on this a little bit, but getting student feedback, I think getting that as early as possible and really implementing that is a big thing that I would recommend. So if you are developing something new, building in moments, even if it's just part of a discussion post and you ask a question about the material itself, you're getting information along the way. It doesn't have to be a high stakes evaluation. It can be little points to find out if it's useful. And then, when I was first starting, I definitely was using the library. So I would recommend that. Like, I don't necessarily know what textbooks might exist here and there. So even just reaching out and asking, like, do you know of any resources that are available, Nancy? And, where can I maybe start with this? And depending on what your deliverable might look like, getting help from folks who are trained in open access copyright information, which is the part where I did not have any expertise in that. So I really needed help.
Excellent, thank you. So, yes, I was just on another panel and I realized how lucky UNC is to have Nancy because a lot of universities don't have a Nancy. And so that is really a great resource that we have on campus. So I was hearing for those overwhelmed but curious OER starters to start small and manageable chunks. Look for those materials in your course that do need an upgrade that you're noticing, and really starting with a course topic that you're well versed in, so it kind of feels a little bit easier and you're not starting from ground zero. And additionally, student feedback, which is always great to get some good student feedback. So the last question I have for everyone is, do you have any additional or other thoughts about creating OER? And we'll start with Corinne, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the grand scale, I think OER is really a great answer to the accusation that colleges and universities are elitist institutions. And I think for a lot of our students, OER is the great leveler. It creates ways of accessing information, content in our courses that is more equitable for them. I think it's a sign to the students that we recognize the obstacles to their success that they encounter. We recognize where there are barriers and that we care enough to try and remove those.
I love that. Michael?
Yeah, I just want to underscore something, and you know, it doesn't take much thought to realize what I've been harping on here, but I do really believe in collaboration, and it leverages whatever we bring to it, and makes it even more effective and powerful. So a shout out to one of my colleagues in geography and sustainability studies, Dr. Chelsea Romulo, because the two of us had been working on an idea for a team taught class for a couple of years at least, and finally were able to offer it last year. And at the core of that class was a very a community engaged assignment where our students connected with retirement facilities in Greeley, and had interviews, sort of oral history interviews, conducted oral history interviews with some of their residents, and super powerful for the students. You know, it was like really influential for them because this multi-generational thing, you know, has a lot of value, but we don't really emphasize it maybe enough in terms of how we learn and how we teach. And so for the students, it was a very high impact kind of a project. And so Dr. Romul and I decided, why don't we turn that project into an OER? And that's what we did. And so we created an assignment, but it draws on existing oral history interviews that are publicly available. So, you know, you don't have to have it set up where you find a retirement home in your community or whatever, but this makes it accessible to folks who don't have access to that, but still want to have that kind of relationship that's cross generation. So we created an oral history project assignment, and we're really proud of it. And so once again, you know, I think when you have an idea, you can play with it and make something happen as an OER, but you also can have it can encourage you to reach out to others who have ideas that and talents and expertise and perspectives that you could bring into the fold and create something utterly new. So it's very exciting.
I work closely with Dr. Romulo, and I could say collaboration is one of the best skills she has taught me. Um, it's very invaluable. And then last but not least, Rose.
Yeah, so I think one of the main things that I was getting out of this, especially with this modern concepts of health and disease, is that this really allows you to like customize your class in a way that textbooks don't. You know, sometimes you'll get a textbook and part of it will be useful, and then students will notice like, hey, I barely use this. I had to buy it, and like, what am I doing? But one of the things that I just sort of naturally did and didn't necessarily realize until the end was make it very Colorado specific. So public health is local, it is state level, of course, connected to what's happening nationally, but this allows me to get into, Colorado housing equality, looking at Weld County data and county level data, looking at local trends and state trends with public health information. And I mean, that's really where we're going to have the most impact with our students moving into their careers is the work that they're doing locally and at the state level. So that was really cool because it was like, oh yeah, a textbook is not going to be able to do that because they're trying to create a resource for the broadest possible audience, and I'm trying to create resources for a localized application of some of those concepts. And so I think that's one of the really cool things that we can do with this that goes beyond what a textbook can offer. Same with including equity and justice concepts, right? Some of these textbooks, while great, may not really be digging into some of the more current events or quote unquote controversial topics or things that students are experiencing on a day-to-day basis because they are trying to appeal to a really broad audience. And public health is constantly changing. It's absolutely connected to injustice and inequity, and we have to talk about those things. And so this really allowed me to make sure that I was honoring those topics in a way that I think a lot of textbooks don't really allow you to necessarily do. And just that this is always like an ongoing project. Like I'm never going to be done with this piece of OER. In fact, I was looking at it. I was like, I know this is not the version that I'm teaching right now anymore, right? Of this outline that I created. It's constantly public health itself is constantly changing. And so to be able to update it on a semester by semester level versus just waiting for a new textbook to come out, I think is really empowering for me. I can make sure that I'm addressing the most current and pressing issues in the field.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing their insights. I certainly learned a lot. So we actually just perfectly landed. We wanted to save at least 10 minutes for some questions. So if anyone in I'll say the Zoom room has a question, please feel free to unmute and ask or throw it in the chat if you'd prefer.
Yeah, that's always tricky because one thing that the reason my title is textbook affordability librarian and not open educational resources librarian is in part because OER is one plank of a larger kind of zero textbook cost ZTC initiative, which can include the LER, right? It can include the library licensed educational resources, which would be the items for library databases. So it would be like, that's the kind of thing that would be like certain, and I have had consultations with instructors for whom ZTC is the way to go because you're making it free for the students because you have that reliance on library resources. And so sometimes the answer is not open. Sometimes the answer is a combo, or it is using the library resources, which are open to UNC students because they've already paid for them by virtue of paying their tuition, right? So while in the, we do a lot of talking, the grants are related to open, this panel. And part of that is because the grant money that we receive from the state of Colorado is meant to be focused on open. And that's because of the legislation that funds it. But thinking more broadly in terms of zero textbook cost and getting students to get access to free resources in whatever form that might take is kind of the broader affordability goal. So sometimes OER is not the answer, right? And sometimes closed materials are better for the topic or the instructor or the course. Yeah, and I'm interested to see if the panelists have any thoughts on that. So from my perspective, right, because I'm coming from like this perspective of serving both the institution and also thinking more broadly of the field and making things available and open to as many people as possible. One thing that we try to do is, especially for big projects. So Mike's project is in Canvas, right? And it's a nice small modular project. One thing that we recommend for big projects is to not do it in a specific LMS. Because even though you can export items in Canvas into these file formats that then can be brought into to Blackboard or D2L or other learning management programs, learning management systems, one thing that we want is that we want people everywhere to have access to this, including in contexts for which there is no LMS. So that's when sometimes I recommend people do something like what Corinne did, which is what I call, it's just like you can use Google Docs and make it a public link. And then, so it's a, quote unquote textbook, but then that can be put in all sorts of repositories and then be available in all sorts of contexts, including internationally, for which you might actually have contexts, well, nationally as well, for which people don't have any LMS. And so basically it's kind of separating the content from the platform to increase that openness.
Yeah, incorporating articles and secondary sources and things. One of the things that I've started to do is in the whatever materials I'm creating kind of outside of Canvas, is I've started to do suggestions for further reading, which can cue an instructor, right, who might be downloading those materials, that they can maybe grab those articles and use them if they like. And then I just tell the students, like, this is more than a suggestion. You also need to read these articles.
I mean, I would say, like, maybe even just asking colleagues in your field of what would be useful for them. I have no idea if a course outline is useful for anyone else in public health, but for me, I'm thinking like, when I've gotten a new class, it's super useful when I can get a syllabus from another faculty member or their reading list or their Canvas shell if, we're at the same institution, or just something to start with. So and I tweak it massively and I add what, my own interests and this and that. But thinking like, hey, if somebody really didn't know where to begin, anything is helpful to start with. So that's kind of where I was, and we ended up on a course outline for that reason. I think it's just like, what's going to be beyond just the syllabus, like how can I give a reading or a video list so somebody doesn't have to duplicate this work again. So maybe just like what would be helpful for other faculty to have that could direct you one kind of route or another.
Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to the panelists for spending your morning with us, and to the attendees and those future attendees that are going to watch the recording. We are going to process the video, and we'll make sure all registrants receive the video link. It'll also be posted on UNC's open repository. So thank you all again, and I hope you all have a wonderful week and wonderful spring break next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's great to see you all.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.